Hello, everyone. My name's Gail Cross. I'm an ID physician at Monash and also here at Bennett Health. And I'm delighted to have Emma present today, and I'll let Phil, my co-convener of this journal club, present, introduce her shortly. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that's on that we meet today. For me, this is the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend that to all First Nation people. I also acknowledge our colleagues, partners, and communities of all of those in attendance today, whose collaboration and shared commitment to improving health outcomes enriches our work. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Gail. I'm Philip De Croo. I'm Gail's wing person for this event, and we're delighted to have Dr. Emma Smith presenting on what I think is actually a well done and important trial for us here, particularly in Australia and probably in the region as well. And Emma is an infectious diseases physician working at Royal Darwin Hospital, and has previously worked here in Melbourne at Monash Health, where I met her in the TB clinic. She's since gone on to bigger and better things and now coming close to finishing her PhD. But she's not going to be talking about her PhD work, although this is very related to her PhD work. So over to you, Emma, with your experience. We're looking forward to how you interpret this paper and make it understandable for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Philippe, for the introduction, and thanks, Gail, for the opportunity to present at the Journal Club. I was particularly excited to see this paper be published. I'm sure people who've heard me talk previously know that I am very strong advocate for weekly Rifapentine Isoniazid, particularly in the area that I work. So I work on Larrakia country up in Darwin, and mostly the work that I do is in remote communities where I think weekly Rifapentine Isoniazid has real significant potential to change the scope of TB preventive treatment. And so I chose this clinical trial that looks at 3 months of weekly Rifapentine Isoniazid versus 4 months of daily Rifampicin for TB infection. And it was very recently, I think only a couple of weeks ago, published in Clinical Infectious Diseases by a group of authors that most people here will be very familiar with in Sydney. And so, as I said, I'm particularly a big fan of 3HP, but I just thought I'd kind of talk a little bit about what the WHO recommendations for TB preventive treatment are currently. And we know that the treatment of TB infection is a key pillar of the WHO NTB strategy. And now within their kind of consolidated guidelines on TB have several options that are available for TPT, including a daily isoniazid for 6 to 9 months, daily rifampicin, weekly rifapentine and isoniazid for 3 months, and daily isoniazid and rifampicin for 3 months, which is mostly used in young children. And really just to talk about the TPT, more recent TPT trials, 3HP is really not a new drug. It's been around for quite some time now, and this early trial, which was 15 years ago now, by Sterling et al., was published in New England Journal of Medicine, and basically found that 3HP was non-inferior to 9 months of daily isoniazid, with better completion rates and lower hepatotoxicity. And equally, 4 months of rifampicin has been found in both adults and children to be non-inferior to 9 months of isoniazid, with also better completion and better safety. But there's really never been any trials comparing daily rifampicin and weekly rifapentine isoniazid. And that's really where this trial comes in. But just to, I'm sure most people are aware of the access issues for 3HP in Australia, but just in case people are not, so the issues with access really are around Rifapentine not being registered with the Therapeutic Goods Administration, so can only be given under the Special Access Scheme. So it's not under PBS, and Rifapentine needs to be purchased through the Global Drug Facility, which makes it quite prohibitive in most settings. And I would say most clinicians are not super familiar with using it. One of the real amazing things about working in the Territory is in the Northern Territories is the TB program has been amazing in recognising that 3HP can be really great in our setting. And so we have got quite a bit of experience using it now, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But just to get back into the to this trial, the aim was to really compare treatment completion among patients with TB infection that were assigned to weekly 3HP using an SMS kind of monitoring process weekly, and comparing that with patients assigned to daily self-administered daily Rifampicin. And so just to take a look at the methods, this was a multi-centre, although all at chest clinics in Sydney. It was prospective and open label, because the drug regimens are really quite different in terms of their frequency. There would have been no ability to blind in this trial. These were all publicly funded TB clinics where there was treatments free for everyone, regardless of immigration status. And just to look at the eligibility criteria, essentially anyone over the age of 2 years, which is become increasingly standard for 3HP, that you can use it up to the point of 2 years and even younger. No, so anyone over the age of 2 years with TB infection, if a respiratory or ID physician recommended treatment. They used a very standard TB infection definition, which was that of a tuberculin skin test result of 10 millimeters or more, or a positive interferon gamma release assay. And people were also eligible to receive treatment if they had HIV, regardless of their TB infection status. And all participants were required to have access to either a mobile or a landline. And of course, as you would expect, TB disease was excluded prior to anyone being enrolled in the trial. The trial did exclude pregnancy or anyone planning to become pregnant during the study period, as well as those who were breastfeeding and those who were planned to have a solid organ transplant. And understandably, they also excluded anyone with TB infection that was thought to be acquired from someone with resistance to either Isoniazid or Rifampicin. They randomized 1-to-1. And in terms of the intervention arm, they used a standard dose of 3HP, which was once a week for 12 weeks, which is weight-based dosing. Important to just note that this was a single pill regimen using 300 milligrams of Rifapentine and 100 milligram tablets of Isoniazid. So if you were over 50 kilos, you essentially got 12 tablets. So it's just important to note there is a fixed dose combination tablet now that we use quite frequently in the NT, but we can talk about that a little later. And for the intervention arm, as I mentioned, adherence was supported through once a week, either text message or a phone call. And the comparator was self-administered daily Rifampicin for 120 doses, based off of standard weight-based dosing. And both groups attended clinic at 1 month and also at the end of treatment. I won't go into this in great detail, but essentially everybody got a baseline liver function test and full blood count. Women got a pregnancy test and they repeated liver function at 1 month. People could, of course, present if they had reported adverse events to the clinic. And everyone was seen at the end of treatment by the treating physician and administered a sort of end of treatment questionnaire talking about sort of satisfaction and acceptability. In terms of the outcomes, the primary outcome was treatment completion, and that was defined as taking 90% or greater of the required doses within 1 month beyond the prescribed treatment period. So for 3HP, that is pretty standardly 11 doses taken within 16 weeks. And for Rifampicin, that was 108 out of 120 doses taken within 5 months. And then the secondary outcomes were participant satisfaction and the proportion of participants who experienced one or more adverse events of any grade. I won't go into the statistics in too much detail, but essentially assumed there was an expected completion rate in the intervention arm of 87%. And thought to be and accounted also for a 10% loss to follow-up, which meant the anticipated sample size was 210 participants, so 105 in each arm, with an 80% power to detect superiority. And importantly, we'll talk about the results and how many people didn't go on to actually receive treatment, but this was an intention to treat analysis, so whether anyone went on to receive treatment or not, whatever they were randomized to was how the analysis was conducted. And there were also some additional adjusted insensitivity analyses. So coming to results, I think probably the study investigators would agree that it was a pretty long recruitment period over 5 years, but bearing in mind that COVID-19 was significant over these years, and I suspect that's why it was a long recruitment period. In terms of their enrollment, they had 106 in the 3HP group and 104 in the Rifampicin group, and a relatively high number of people that didn't that never commenced therapy. So 20 in the Rifampicin group for various reasons, and 12 in the 3HP group. The baseline characteristics were similar, and I'll not go into these in a great amount of detail, but I just want to highlight the fact that this was a relatively young cohort, as expected, as the predominant, cohort that you would be doing TB infection testing on. I'll just note that most of the testing done in this study, most of the people diagnosed with TB infection were healthcare workers undergoing pre-employment screening. 90% were born overseas with a high kind of predominance from Asia, and it was an extremely well cohort with no with most people with no significant medical comorbidities, and only one participant with HIV. So these are the primary and secondary outcomes, but I'll just draw your attention to the primary outcome of completion of treatment. So as you can see, there was a significantly increased completion of treatment in the 3HP group, so 85% versus 65% of participants completing that 90% or above, with a relative risk of 1.3. Importantly, the other secondary outcomes of sort of acceptability were also significantly higher in the 3HP arm, in the intervention arm. And also importantly, we see that the safety, so the experience of one or greater adverse events from any grade, was similar across both groups, and no kind of statistically significant difference between those. In terms of the text message monitoring that occurred in the 3HP group, a large proportion, almost 80%, find that monitoring very helpful, and 70% said they would choose SMS monitoring for TPT in the future. This is just to go through the adverse events in a little more detail. So a reported adverse event of any grade happened in 24.5% in the 3HP arm and 20% in the Rifampicin group. There was a higher discontinuation of therapy due to an adverse event in the Rifampicin group, so 11% versus 3.8%. And I just wanted to also draw your attention to the systemic drug reaction, in that this actually occurred very infrequently in this trial. Only one patient with a suspected systemic drug reaction or hypersensitivity reaction that was actually in the Rifampicin group. And I'll just note that this proportion in the original Sterling trial was 3.5% in the 3HP group, and we've certainly seen higher rates of this in the NT kind of programmatic setting. You actually need systemic drug reaction definition is actually quite you need to score quite a bit to score systemic drug reaction. So it's essentially either one of these two criteria has to be met. The first criteria is one of either hypotension, urticaria, angioedema, acute bronchospasm, or conjunctivitis, or 4 or more of the following symptoms, and one of which has to be at least grade 2. So that's weakness, fatigue, nausea, vomiting, headache, fever, ache, sweats, dizziness, shortness of breath, flushing, or chills. So it's actually quite a strict definition. And just to remind you, there were no SDRs in the 3HP group here, which is quite encouraging. So that's the majority of the results. And just to kind of bring all of that together, weekly Rifapentine Isoniazid with once a week text message adherence support achieved significantly higher treatment completion than daily Rifampicin. And this really supports 3HP as the preferred short course approach in programmatic settings. There's probably a lot of reasons why there was better adherence. I mean, once a weekly dosing schedule is obviously significantly less burdensome than daily self-administered treatment. It's a shorter 12-week versus 16-week duration. And of course, the weekly reminders provide some structured adherence support and is feasible in a TB clinic, whereas sending a daily text message and follow-up is probably just not sustainable in most TB clinics, whereas weekly is quite a bit easier. I know in the NT we do video observation, and that does increase workload on the TB nurses quite substantially. As we've already kind of alluded to, both regimens were very well tolerated. Most of the adverse events were only grade 1 or 2, and only one participant experienced a systemic drug reaction. I think it is important to note that pregnant women and patients being evaluated for a solid organ transplant were excluded. And I don't know if any of the paper authors are here to kind of talk about the decision making around that. I'd love to hear that. And only one participant was HIV positive, so maybe not particularly generalizable to that population. And I think I mentioned earlier that most people included in this study were health workers with pre-employment screening and patients intended for immunosuppressive therapy. And so, a very well-engaged cohort of people in healthcare. And so the authors reflected that the findings may not be generalizable to populations with greater social disadvantage. But I will talk in a minute about our experience in the NT, where we've really had great success actually in people with significantly more social disadvantage than what was in this trial. So I'll just very quickly talk very briefly about our NT experience just for comparison. So in the urban Darwin setting, we have more than 200 patients have received 3HP now. We did a sort of matched cohort comparison of our first 115 patients compared to 9 months of Isoniazid, because that is the standard regimen that we use in the NT, and found significantly higher completion and less side effects, very much what has been seen in this trial. But we have seen a systemic drug reaction rate of around 5% in those patients. And just to say, we've now started to adapt this into the remote setting, which has been really encouraging, and community health workers are really leading the way. with this, we've trained a number of community health workers now to be able to deliver medications to patients' houses or workplaces, and are really finding quite significant improvement in the amount of people that are getting through treatment. So far, 23 people have been put on treatment, with 3 experiencing some side effects and 1 not completing because of side effects. So we've really been seeing quite a. This is a setting where 9 months of Isoniazid is almost impossible to deliver. So it's been really encouraging for us. And really, I wanted to, very happy to kind of open the discussion and talk, but I think as a consequence of this trial, I think we really need to be asking ourselves how we can increase access to 3HP in Australia. It's shown really great promise in a number of settings now, and I think, it would be a really beneficial thing for TB programs to have across Australia, for treatment, for increasing their kind of scope of treating TB infection. So super happy to open it up for discussion from here.
Thank you so much. Before we go on, I just wanted to also I wanted to mention that Professor Greg Fox to Vicky Chang, the last authors of the paper, are here. So Greg's a physician and an eminent clinical trialist at the University of Sydney and director of the Sydney Vietnam Institute. And his work focuses on prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of TB. And he's played a key role in shaping global health policy of TB. Vicky, if I'm not mistaken, Vicky, you ran this trial as part of your PhD with Greg. So we're thrilled that you could make it here today. Why don't we open with this excellent question from Emma to perhaps the authors, and maybe you could start, Greg, by telling us how can we increase access to 3HP now that...
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks, Emma, for presenting the study and for the opportunity to respond. So I'm in my TB clinic right now, actually, and I'm pleased to say that at least in New South Wales, we have converted over to using 3HP as our first-line therapy for TB preventive therapy. And so the New South Wales TB program has an ongoing order through the Global Drug Facility, and our hospital has 3HP on formulary. And so it's just a matter for us to prescribe it through the clinic. There's a special access form that needs to be completed online, which the nurses do. And we've continued to use the same approach that we did in the trial, where our nurses still send SMSs weekly to patients. So I had 2 patients today that I saw in follow-up for 3HP. So it's a common treatment now.
Fantastic. This will be followed up, I think, very well by Dr. Harry Walker's question for both perhaps anyone in the audience who prescribes 3HP as their preferred regimen, or even as part of any regimen for GPT. How do you counsel patients when starting them on 3HP?
I guess I usually list out all the options to them. And I kind of told them this has been approved by WHO for quite a long while. And I then told them about what's the literature available. I guess the only one thing that in our trial, we also not use the fixed dose, which I think now the one that we got from the Global Health Facility is a fixed dose, which actually makes a big improvement in terms of the pills burden. When I was like consenting a patient for the trial, I was like, oh, look, it's quite a numbers of tablets. It's every week. But now with the fixed dose, which is only 3 tablets plus the vitamin B6, it's actually quite good in terms of pill burden. So most patients would like this option. I have to say, I still use the older, like in terms of Isoniazid in certain patients if they have interaction with the Rifampicin drugs, if they're on other pre-existing medications. So I would still use them. But in terms of like a patients otherwise doesn't have drug interactions and convenience, they both quite think that this is quite feasible. And I don't have lots of patients with doubting in terms of like the efficacy about it, because it's been recommended by WHO anyway, just we haven't been start using it in the past.
Thanks, Vicky. Emma had a question before about why the trial wasn't able to recruit patients who had the ability to become pregnant or transplant. People who, I noticed that you actually had transplant recipients possibly because there were some who were on immunosuppressive drugs, but I just wondered too, why you excluded people who were listed to get transplant or might receive a transplant.
So when we designed the protocol, we basically followed the eligibility criteria of the Tim Sterling paper, and so that was one of them. Because this is a phase 4 pragmatic study, so it was really looking at the outcome of treatment adherence rather than being able to enroll enough people that we would learn whether it was safe in that population. There's obviously complexities around drug interactions, and we didn't want to delay transplantation if it was happening urgently.
I just wondered, Greg, as a phase 4 trial, it would also be an opportune time to test the regimen in pregnancy. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the issue with pregnancy is more of a general approach for preventative therapy, which is different to TB disease. So in preventative therapy, typically there's not an urgency to treat, and it's possible to wait until the pregnant woman delivers. And although Isoniazid and Rifapentine are widely used in TB disease, the potential for toxicity is not zero. And so I think for that reason, I think in general our clinical practice is to delay until after delivery preventative therapy.
Mine too. Yeah. Emma, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment about that. We've had a few women reactivate like quite soon postpartum, and so I've actually really switched my mindset around TPT in pregnancy. Like, I tend to avoid it in the first trimester, but then I actually actively try and give people TPT because we've just had some really like awful situations where like young women with young babies are coming to us with cavitary smear positive disease, which I think the risk of like giving 3HP versus the risk of the baby getting exposed to smear positive mom. I've really switched that around, and anecdotally, like, I've had no issues with 3HP in sort of later pregnancy, but of course it's individual patient choice, and I counsel them about that. But we just have had a few women reactivate very early postpartum where I have regretted not giving TPT earlier.
Thanks, Emma.
There's a couple of questions in the chat I might pick up. There was one from Karsha. Firstly, probably a quick one maybe for Vicky or Greg. What's the situation with regard to drug interactions for Rifapentine compared with Rifampicin? And then I think there was a second question from Karsha just around, now that we're looking at the options that we have available, which one do you think we should, is it only 3HP? Is it more that you look at patient choice? How do we approach this? Is it physician choice, patient choice, somewhere in the middle?
I think for the Rifapentine, I mean, it could still impact with lots of medications. So I always want the medication interaction check. And to be honest, I think like they're fairly similar family anyway, especially lots of anti-epileptics. So I think if they are sometimes have interaction with rifampicin, most likely they might have rifapentine as well, that I would probably avoid this altogether. And you might have to go back to isoniazid, unfortunately, in those situations rather than risk it, especially with seizures and things like that. In terms of whether I probably would this day, I don't use a lot of isoniazid unless there's no other options. So most of the time will be more like a 3 months, 4 months option when I did counseling for the patient. And a lot of time, given that it's a weekly dosing, not a big pill burdens and easier for the patient, they most likely will choose that. But unless some have a particular idea against using 2 medications at the same time, because it's isoniazid with rifapentine together, most time that will be my standard of care at the moment. The only issues I think is obviously, despite we have this global drugs and facility, we have enough stock. I think some hospital can still run out from time to time, so that sometimes there is a stock situation. But most time, I would give the option to the patients of the 3 months and the 4 months options, and then we have discussions about it.
Just to add one more thing as well, in New South Wales at the moment, we're part of the TB Trials Consortium's asteroid trial, which is a trial of 6 weeks of daily rifapentine. And so we are now recruiting to that trial. And so therefore, we give patients both the choice of 3HP and 4-RIF. And if they decide on either of those and then want to be in the trial, then either of those could be the comparator against the 6 weeks of rifapentine. And it's interesting. I think patients prefer 6 weeks of rifapentine, if they can get it even over the 3HP. So that will be another, if it's effective, results expected in about 2030, but that will be another regimen which is coming down the pipeline.
See, things that struck me in reading your trial was that even though there wasn't a signal of the systemic drug reaction being prominent, there was certainly a fair bit more of the flu-like syndromes, which I think is typically experienced with people who take big doses of rifampicin or rifamycins at a single point. But what was pleasing to see about that was that it really didn't have any consequential effects. So people developed these flu-like syndromes, but it didn't interrupt their treatment. And really, at the end of the day, that's what we want. And preferences for the drug for the 3HP regimen remain. Several other questions that have come through as well. There was a pre-meeting question from Santa Saka, who asked, did participants continued treatment report specific barriers unique to daily versus the weekly regimen? So were there, amongst those who discontinued, were you in a position that you could collect that data that told you why they discontinued?
Raw data yesterday, actually. I mean, we don't really when people didn't complete, we didn't quite specific ask the question, is it because of the treatment that you got allocated that you couldn't complete because of the frequency and things? But looking at the people who discontinue, excluding people who never started, for people at least at one dose of the medication, all the 4 participants in the 3HP arm stopped themselves because of side effect, but not stopped by the clinician. And out of the 16 people in the 4-RIF arm that stopped treatment, about 9 stopped it themselves because of the adverse event, and 3 of them was also stopped by the clinician. But I couldn't quite comment whether, in terms of the remaining in the 4-RIF group, is it because of the frequency of the medication, that's why they couldn't complete it, or some other reason.
Sorry, yeah, there's another question just around experience with 1HP. I don't know if other people have experience with using that from either the presenter or Greg or Vicky. No.
Unfortunately, I don't really have much experience with 1HP. I haven't ventured onto that yet.
I've certainly used it overseas and seen good results. And again, there's sort of an enthusiasm from some people to go, I want to do it daily and get it over with. But there's definitely people who say, I'd much prefer to take a tablet or tablets weekly. So there is something, different. Ellen had privately messaged me. I just see a question from Ellen asking about a project that is on the web and looks amazing, but in reality has been a lot of paperwork and far from amazing, a project called GP Prepare, where we've been proposing trying to use the 1HP for refugees in the refugee health clinic at Monash as a 1-month treatment, and sort of struggling with the SAS access for the mono formulation. It's fine to get the fixed dose combination. And so, when you have to fill in an SAS-A as life-threatening, it doesn't seem to add up. So, it's I don't know if N-Vasilo1, sorry if I don't know your first name. Did you want to comment because you've used it a couple of times?
Yeah, hi, it's Nan Vasilinas here from the Women's and Children's in Adelaide. We've used it a couple of times in very, very difficult to reach actually Aboriginal community adolescents who we just could not reach until they were in juvenile detention, and there was a very limited period of time that they were in detention, and they were very happy to take it. They were just very difficult to engage with, and so we used the 1HP as a we knew there wasn't too much literature on it, but we thought it was probably better than nothing.
I might ask, one of the things that stood out to me also in the paper, and not that I engaged with the TPT trial literature much, was really about the reasons for not commencing treatment in the first place. I think in this trial, Vicky and Greg's trial, it was 15%. Which I think is, quite a substantial proportion. And then looking at the number who actually went on to complete 50% or more, which is in the supplementary data, or, the very high standard that Greg and Vicky showed at 90% or more completion, and the difference across those two groups. But a lot of people don't complete treatment. And I wondered, clearly that I guess there may be a signal of intolerance that we're not capturing, but is there a preconception of people not thinking that they need to? That is the reason why people don't commence or don't really even get past that 3 months of treatment. The first week or two of treatment. If Emma, Vicky, or Greg could comment on why uptake of TPT is poor.
Lots of a big groups of our patients come for the screening because they're healthcare worker. So they're mainly a work screening. So it's not like they need an immunosuppressed medication or something like that. I think with that concept, like a healthcare worker say, I just need to do it for work. A lot of times, like, do I do it? I will get my work clearance. They're actually not really concerned about TB reactivation. They're concerned about they're going to get their job and get the contract started. So I think that's kind of makes the data could be not representative in that sense. And we in real clinical practice, I see a lot of healthcare workers for that reason. And then most of the time they would come back to me and say, oh, I have a thing about at home. I decide not to start this medication anymore. I'm going to do some X-ray surveillance. So I think that probably explains some of the reason.
Thanks. Ellen, you have a question?
Not a question, sort of statement. I think we've been doing some work about what we could do in primary care, which was part of the reason for asking about the GP repair. And, on face value, when you look at like TST in 4D or IGRA in 4D or whatever on an individual patient benefit, I think that tool is actually doesn't, it's a very useful tool, but I think it actually paints a picture that it can actually decrease uptake of TPT on what it might otherwise. Particularly, I think when it's, I think that obviously people are experienced about talking TB, then using that tool in conjunction with conversations as well and risk factors. Whereas I think when you're potentially looking at people that might be having this conversation that don't have that, everyday familiarity with TB, I think it is probably a demotivating factor for TPT. Just because it does, in reality, the chances of progression outside of immunosuppression, a variety of other things is obviously pretty low. So I think that's probably one of the reasons, like to try and portray the risk accurately in the absence of other risk factors that might cause progression of TB disease. And I think just to thanks, Phil, for answering my question from the chat, but I think the other thing is, I think 3HP would be much more ideal than 4 months of rifampicin when we're thinking about starting to see whether we could do more for our migrants in a primary care space. But I think that GPs, in TB, we talk about unregistered drugs all the time, until very recently, practically every single patient was on unregistered drugs till pyrizinamide just got registered. But I think that's not really the experience for GPs. And we haven't had those conversations yet, but we are anticipating from the consultation that we have done with RCGP and a couple of individuals that really, a drug that's registered in Australia is just a lot more of a, safety net for them in terms of prescribing than to go down 3HP, even though it is probably, much more patient-friendly regimen. Just that hurdle of being unregistered and being confident to be able to discuss that in terms of where it's and why potentially it's not unregistered, I think is a challenge.
Emma, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just to come to your question, Gail, about why TPT is just so hard to, convince people to take TPT. I think, it comes down to like any preventative measure. Like if people feel well, then they just basically we have to make it as easy and convenient as possible. And I think that's why 3HP is quite exciting because especially in the remote setting where we have had like really, really low rates of completion and uptake of TPT. But anecdotally, once you say someone's going to bring this medication to your house once a week and give it to you, like the amount of people that now want to have treatment is honestly like it's just it's a completely different story. We were basically barely putting anyone on TPT and now everyone wants TPT. We've got lists of people that we're like we can't do it quick enough basically. So I think it's about, you know, if people are completely well, it has to be as easy and convenient as possible. Otherwise, like how can someone possibly prioritize it amongst like the rest of what's going on in their world, I think.
That's so insightful, particularly because I'm interested in treatment support. And in the trial that Vicky and Greg ran, they used SMS reminders for the 3HP regimen as a form of adherence support. I asked this question at the TBCRE meeting that Greg organizes every year, and I'll plug it if anyone's interested in an excellent TB meeting. It's run every year, so you can Google it and find it. It's a 2-day meeting with lots of great science. But essentially, Simone Barry is also using 3HP regimen as TPT in South Australia amongst our First Nation communities. And they also use the model that she describes is very similar to yours, Emma, in the NT, which is where they provide support by means of delivering the medication to homes. And a lot of that is about the cold chain of the drugs as well. I did have a question about really the necessity of needing SMS reminders. And whether Vicky, you'd be able to comment on that. Do you think that this regimen would work in the absence of SMS reminders, or whether the uptake, the completion rates would be equivalent for a 4R, sorry.
Just speaking on the recent experience, like we actually use a lot of fixed dose when there was shortage of rifampicin as of end of last year at some clinic because there's rifampicin shortage. So a lot of patients have to have 3HP or otherwise they have to go to have 9 months isoniazid of the TBT. For that groups that we had at St. George, we actually didn't use SMS monitoring at all. But there was only about 50 patients. And so far, the completion rate was still pretty good. I mean, we have 2 people drop off for different reasons. But of the trial where we did it was mainly to trial the SMS monitoring because the regional trial, they actually used dots, which I don't think is practical at all. I guess have to say what's the actual real clinical experience. To me, I feel it should be because lots of medication they say a weekly patients still take it, like in the sense like, you know, if they're on weekly Mounjaro, they still going to have the injection this day. I think it's what the patient prioritizes importance in their life and they should be able to get that arrangement. So, yeah.
Maybe I can jump in there as well just to say that we've been using the 3HP in a refugee clinic and we'd initially tried to use the 1HP thinking, oh, it'll be easier for people to take a daily dose with reminders than to try and do a weekly dose. We don't do SMS messaging and actually I've been once again surprised that with good education, people actually are fine taking it and just ensuring that you actually have good interpreters and that you have a bit of time with patients, I think is the other thing. And so sometimes that means the extra resource of having a nurse or someone who has a bit more time to spend counselling with people who have a lot going on in their lives. I think there's a big difference between maybe healthcare workers and refugees sometimes in terms of what's going on in their life. But I guess there'll probably need to be different little adaptations depending on populations and clinics. Yeah, so that was, but maybe also to say, Shivani, I think is on the line, will be someone to follow up with some of her work that she's starting in her PhD, looking at how we can have models that maybe decentralize some of the care and look at shifting a task shifting away from doctors to nurses and so on would be the dream for some of us who have long waiting lists of people waiting, 6+ months to see a doctor for a disease that's not causing them problems yet. Yeah, I do wonder though, if you have any reflections from the study or your practice, Emma, around. I get the impression that we take a long time to see people to then give them a preventive treatment, and probably the people who need it most, picking up, Emma, on your thought around the people who are pregnant or other people who have the highest risk, getting it to the right people at the right time. I just wonder on your thoughts on how this helps streamline practice or your tips for bringing it on board maybe for people who haven't yet been using it.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Philippe. Like we definitely we have a very different, I guess, setup. I'm frequently going to remote communities for contact tracing purposes and starting people on these drugs for because they've been contacts of a infectious TB case. So my experience is quite different. Although in the NT we share the same thing of long clinics in the kind of urban Darwin setting. I just happen to work in a slightly different setting where I'm mostly remote. And I think one of the really big barriers that we have is obviously that these drugs aren't available in remote communities, again, because of the sort of regulatory things. And I think that's it, certainly in my setting is one of the big issues, because I can't start it often when I'm in community. I have to visit community, have the conversations, and then we have to kind of come back, do all the paperwork, and then it kind of gets sent out, and sometimes you really just want to start it there and then, as people are engaged. So that's the sort of, I guess that's one of my reflections, is that although we can get it from the global drug facility, I do still think there is major scope for pushing for it to be a registered drug so that the availability is easier, and also then it can be available in more remote kind of regional sites where actually I think the really big benefit comes in for having weekly medication versus daily. That's my my thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about is whether if accessibility to 3HB, understanding it's the tolerability issues and the safety issues, which I think are well established, could be done in the primary care setting. I think we'd see a huge amount of uptake, particularly amongst where I work in the migrant setting, not amongst the First Nations, where there are other vulnerabilities, Emma, that you discussed that need to be considered. I thank you, Greg, for the comment. I was very curious about the questionnaire that was developed to understand tolerability, because that's something I think if we had a tool to measure this, either in our clinical setting or in future prospective work that we'd like to do, I think it would be very useful to have something that has been at least validated once. So I don't know if Vicky or yourself want to describe the questionnaire. I didn't see it in the supplementary data. So just briefly, if you want to describe what sort of questions were asked about acceptability.
I think there was about top 15 questions. I think also mainly asked about whether they have any problems in picking up the medication, whether they have any issues in like if they say they forgot the medication, what's the reason? Are they away, or because they couldn't get to the clinic, or because they whatever, or they just simply forgot? And if they did forgot, does the SMS actually help them? Or we also have some question about, in particular, SMS, because there was some privacy issues that some patients particularly were about getting some SMS. Is this like a scam message and things like that? So we also explore that. Would they have worried about, is SMS not good And it was actually during the COVID. So some of our patients actually receive phone call if they don't respond to SMS. So we also ask some question about if they have a phone call instead, do they feel more comfortable or do they feel less comfortable because of no caller ID? So that was what we developed, but it wasn't like a validated tool that we developed for our study.
I mean, I think there's a couple of specific questions just around formulary and access in particular. But I think we've kind of mostly covered those. So most of that is going to be getting in touch with your relevant TB program, I would say. I think it might be useful for NTAC to put something around to each of the states and share the experience to help speed it up would be, I think, useful if anyone is on NTAC on this call. Otherwise, we can give a nudge to people who we know are. Again, registration, I think, is a big issue. But that's sort of kind of hard to push because it's who takes on some of the responsibility, and it needs usually to be pharmaceutical company, etc. Ellen, you have your hand up, and maybe that might be the last comment or question, and then we might look to wrap up.
Sure. I'll disclose I'm on NTAC. But I was going to say, I think it's really tricky. I mean, particularly the fixed dose combinations are generally mass manufactured in India and things for the global drug facility. And the registration costs here to register drugs there is a very high bar. I think it's extremely unlikely unless we can find a very side niche one that these particular products would get registered, though obviously that would be so ideal. I think that though there is discussions about some of the other perhaps MDR drugs looking at registration of those, but again, they tend to have a commercial company behind them. So I think that's the big barrier here, particularly. And, it might be possible, Rifapentine itself, Sanofi manufactures, who's obviously in this market. And I know they did look at registration of Rifapentine specifically back, I'm going to say around 2016, and must have not deemed it, marketability or commercial at that particular point in time. And I think given that we're using quite a lot of the fixed dose combinations and not actually necessarily purchasing the Sanofi Rifapentine product, it probably makes it less likely they're going to be inspired to suddenly register Rifapentine itself. So I think it's a real challenge. I'm not sure how this will be overcome, but NTAC does, talk with the TGA sort of at least annually, and there's been a lot of progress. I mean, I think getting it onto SASC was a really, really positive step, which is a special access scheme notification process rather than requiring to prescribe, put in a form, wait for it to be approved, and then start. At least now it's a notification. You can start people, notify the TGA. I think that's removed a lot of barriers, but obviously it's not as ideal as registration. So I think there's certainly NTAC, it's always trying to push these things for TB drugs, but it's a really tricky legislative space to work in.
And I think if NTAC did approve the drug, whether it was registered or not for accessibility, I wonder if we would be able to do this without SMS reminders, because I think the anecdotal experience at least is that perhaps that's not necessary for completion from the various people who prescribed it.
I mean, certainly I don't think that's standard in New South Wales to do reminders. Some clinics may be, but it's not necessarily standard. There is actually going to be a new so the previous NTAC latent TB guideline was in 2017, and there is a new one that hopefully will be published reasonably soon, and 3HP is included in that. So I think from a policy perspective, most states are, have mechanisms to get it if they want to, and so I don't think it's a barrier there at the moment, but there will be some more guidance from NTAC coming out. It won't shock anyone what it says, I don't think so, but it is, of course, one of the included regimens.
Fantastic. Well, in the last few minutes, I think we will close the meeting. I'd like everyone to thank Emma, please, for presenting this paper, and Greg and Vicky for making time in both their clinics to attend. I think this is honestly probably going to change how we treat TPT in Australia, which is not something you get to say often. So I'm very glad that you could be here for it. Our next meeting will be in a month's time. We have two presenters from the Philippines, Dr. Maricel Glare and Dr. Giselle. I don't know what paper they're going to present yet, but it will be in your inboxes. So thank you once again for attending.